At the company board meeting, my husband's father, the CEO, stared me down and said, "You're fired. Poor performance." That night, my husband slid a list of shelters across the table and whispered, "You're on your own now." I walked out silently. Days later, he and his father flooded my phone, 78 missed calls, after finding out who I really was. I thought the worst part of my day was opening with a soft, reflective, then quickly hardening tone. Can you imagine being publicly fired, humiliated in front of your colleagues, and then walking through your own front door, only to find your husband waiting for you? Not with comfort, but with a cold, calculated map to your own displacement? That's exactly what happened to me. He slid a list of women's shelters across our kitchen counter, each one highlighted, one even circled with a note about the nearest metro. "Now that you're unemployed," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. What kind of person is that? What kind of husband? I understood then, with a brutal, sickening clarity, that I had been set up. But what they didn't know is that I'd been planning something, too. Something they would never see coming. Transition. Slightly warmer, more conversational, inviting tone, before we dive deeper into the story of betrayal and, well, strategic justice, if you believe that talent and contribution should always be recognized, no matter what. Please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's free, and it helps these stories reach more women who need to hear them. Now, let's see what happens next. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To truly understand how I ended up holding a list of homeless shelters while my entire life disintegrated in real time, you need to know how carefully I'd built the life that was now crumbling. Shift to narrative flashback. Slightly romantic, then subtly ominous tone. It started 3 years earlier, at a cybersecurity conference in Boston. Back then, I was consulting independently, and my future felt like something I completely controlled. Jack Caldwell stood in the back row during my presentation on predictive threat architecture, actually taking notes. That alone made him different. Most people in those audiences were there for the networking lunch, scrolling their phones. But Jack was engaged, leaning forward, pen moving across his notepad as I explained how my framework could identify vulnerabilities before attackers even recognized they existed. During the Q&A, he asked a technical question that proved he'd been listening, really listening. After the session, he waited while 3 other consultants pitched me with varying degrees of desperation, then approached with a smile that felt genuinely warm, not rehearsed. We talked for 2 hours in the hotel lobby. He represented Caldwell Technologies, his family's firm, but he spoke about it with a measured distance, like someone who understood the business without being consumed by it. He asked intelligent questions, shared insights, and listened when I explained my theories. When he asked for my contact information, it felt professional. When he called 3 days later to invite me to dinner, it felt like possibility. Pacing slows, a sense of growing unease seeps in. Our courtship unfolded with what I interpreted as respectful deliberation. Casual dinners, then a weekend trip to Cape Cod, where we walked beaches and talked about everything except work. Slowly, I was introduced to his social circle. He never rushed, never pushed, always checked in to make sure I was comfortable. At the time, that patience felt like respect. Looking back now, I can see how it was also an assessment. Each stage a test to see if I'd fit into the space he'd already designated for me. 6 months after we met, Jack took me back to that same Boston hotel. Same lobby, different conversation. He proposed over coffee, not champagne, in jeans, not a suit, with a ring that was beautiful but not ostentatious. Everything about the gesture felt authentic, like he understood I valued substance over performance. I said yes before he'd even finished asking, certain I'd found someone who saw me as an equal, not an acquisition. Tone becomes heavy, a hint of regret and self-recrimination. My mother's reaction arrived like a weather warning I chose to ignore. When I called to tell her the news, there was a long pause before she said, very carefully, "That's wonderful, honey. Just remember that families like the Caldwells operate differently than people like us. You'll always be an outsider to them, no matter what Jack promises." I dismissed her concern as generational cynicism. Jack had assured me repeatedly that his father valued expertise, that Henry Caldwell had built his company by recognizing talent regardless of background. I believed him because the alternative meant acknowledging I was walking into something far more complicated than love. The wedding took place 8 months later. Elegant but understated. Intimate. Only much later did I recognize how many of those choices had been gently steered by Jack's suggestions, his family's expectations, dressed up as my own taste. I kept my maiden name professionally, a decision Jack publicly supported. But his mother, Patricia, made small, pointed comments about tradition and family unity at every opportunity. I took Jack's public support as proof of his progressive values, evidence that he was different. Now I understand it was simply another performance, granting me the illusion of independence while the parameters of my new life were being drawn around me with invisible ink. Shift to corporate environment, cold, dehumanizing tone, rising frustration. 2 months into our marriage, Henry Caldwell summoned me to his office. The building itself was designed to intimidate, all glass and steel, a lobby with soaring ceilings, security protocols that required badging through 5 checkpoints just to reach the executive floor. Henry's office occupied a prime corner with panoramic city views, furnished with a desk large enough to land a small aircraft. He gestured for me to sit in the lower chair, a power dynamic so obvious it bordered on parody. "Violet," he began, using my first name with the casual familiarity of someone who considered such intimacy his privilege. "Jack tells me you're one of the brightest minds in cybersecurity. We could use someone with your skills on our team." He delivered this as if offering an extraordinary opportunity, not fulfilling an obligation to employ his new daughter-in-law somewhere visible but contained. The position was mid-level systems analyst, responsible for maintaining existing infrastructure and running routine diagnostics. The salary was 30% less than I'd earned as a consultant, a fact Henry mentioned with the clear expectation that I'd understand family came with certain financial sacrifices. Jack had encouraged me to accept, framing it as an investment in our marriage, stable schedules, no more travel, the ability to build a life together. His logic made surface sense. I told myself the pay cut was temporary, that I'd demonstrate my value and advance on merit. I accepted, officially joining Caldwell Technologies as both the CEO's daughter-in-law and an employee who happened to have relevant skills. Growing. Resentment. A sense of being suffocated. The reality of the work revealed itself within the first week. Henry assigned me maintenance tasks a competent intern could have handled. Updating firewalls, running security audits on systems I could have redesigned from scratch to be significantly more effective. When I drafted proposals for infrastructure improvements that would save the company substantial money, they were met with polite nods and then disappeared into filing systems, never to be mentioned again. My suggestions in team meetings were acknowledged with the patronizing patience people reserve for children. I was there to fulfill a role, not to contribute meaningfully. The company had hired me as proof of their progressive values. Look at us. We have the CEO's daughter-in-law working as a systems analyst. See how modern and merit-based we are. The irony of being simultaneously overeducated for my assigned tasks and completely dismissed for my actual expertise wasn't lost on me. But I told myself it was temporary. I'd prove myself. I was naive enough to believe performance would eventually matter more than politics. Shift to secret defiance, a spark of resolve despite the pain. 6 months of that professional suffocation drove me to start building something in secret. Late nights, when the office emptied and only the janitorial staff remained, I began designing a new security framework on my personal laptop, storing everything on encrypted servers with no connection whatsoever to Caldwell systems. I called it the Sentinel Protocol, an architecture built on predictive threat analysis, using pattern recognition algorithms I'd been refining for years. Every component was meticulously documented and patented under my maiden name, through a limited liability company I registered in Delaware, Monroe Security Solutions. A shell company that existed only on paper and in the digital infrastructure I was constructing, line by line. Jack never asked why I stayed late. Henry never questioned what I might be working on beyond my assigned tasks. They both operated under the comfortable assumption that I was simply trying to prove myself, putting in extra hours to earn acceptance. What they fundamentally failed to understand was that I'd stopped seeking their acceptance entirely. I was building an escape route, creating something that belonged exclusively to me in a world where everything else seemed to be slowly slipping from my control. I wasn't stealing intellectual property. I was creating insurance against a future I couldn't yet articulate, but somehow sensed approaching. Voice becomes weary, sad, then sharp with insight. Around our first anniversary, the marriage itself began its quiet disintegration. Jack started checking his phone obsessively during dinners, stepping into the bedroom to take calls from his father that apparently couldn't wait. When I asked about his day, his answers became vague, distracted. He stopped asking about my work entirely, and our conversations contracted to pure logistics. I tried everything. Elaborate date nights he'd cancel last minute. Weekend getaways that never materialized. I initiated conversations about our future and watched his eyes glaze over. Family dinners at the Caldwell estate became torture disguised as tradition. Patricia, Henry's wife and Jack's mother, had perfected the art of the subtle insult, delivered with a smile. Comments about my wardrobe, questions about my career ambitions phrased to suggest ambition was unseemly in a Caldwell wife. Pointed inquiries about when I'd provide grandchildren. Jack sat through these dinners in practiced silence, never once defending me. His silence felt like complicity. Late at night, lying next to a man who felt increasingly like a stranger, I'd stare at the ceiling, trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything had shifted. But there was no single moment. It was erosion, gradual and relentless. The slow, patient work of water wearing down stone until the foundation developed cracks too deep to repair. The life I'd built with Jack Caldwell, I was beginning to understand, had been constructed on borrowed ground. I just didn't realize how soon the lease would expire, or how brutal the eviction would be. Rising tension, a sense of impending doom. The elevator ride to the executive floor that Tuesday morning felt different, though I couldn't have articulated why. I'd received an email the previous afternoon. Brief, vague, performance evaluation. Quarterly review. Your presence required. Conference room V, 8:30 a.m. The phrasing struck me as odd. Quarterly reviews were team presentations, not individual evaluations. But I pushed the unease aside and prepared thoroughly, compiling 3 years of data into a presentation that documented every success, every breach prevented, every dollar saved. I arrived at 8:15, tablet loaded with charts and graphs that told an undeniable story of excellence. My division had prevented 3 major breaches, exceeding targets by 42%. I felt confident, even proud. I had every reason to expect recognition, perhaps even advancement. The conference room was set to what felt like Arctic temperature when I entered. Henry sat at the head of the table, but the people flanking him made my stomach drop. Marcus from operations, a man I'd interacted with twice in 3 years. A woman in a dark suit I didn't recognize, holding a legal pad with the careful posture of someone whose job involved witnessing and documenting. No one from my team was present. Not a single person who could corroborate my work. I should have turned around. The setup was obvious in retrospect, isolated, outnumbered, facing people with no knowledge of my contributions. But I was still operating under the assumption that facts mattered. I took my seat, ready to present the truth in data form. Voice tightens with barely suppressed anger and disbelief. Henry didn't smile. He didn't offer coffee or make small talk. He just shuffled a stack of papers with theatrical precision, each movement designed to make me wait and wonder. When he finally looked up, his voice carried the smooth, practiced authority of someone who'd delivered difficult news many times before. Violet, he began, we've been reviewing your division's performance metrics. Unfortunately, the results aren't meeting our expectations or the standards we've set for leadership positions. The words registered individually before assembling into meaning. Performance metrics not meeting expectations, I actually thought for a moment he was talking about someone else's division. Then I saw his expression, not apologetic, not uncomfortable, but satisfied. A way that made my skin feel too tight. This was exactly the meeting I'd been summoned to attend. I'm sorry, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, but last quarter's numbers exceeded every projection. We beat targets by 42%. The security upgrades I implemented saved the company an estimated $4 million. Client satisfaction scores have improved by 28%. I reached for my tablet, fingers moving automatically to pull up the spreadsheets. The visual representation of undeniable success. Henry didn't even glance at the screen. He just smiled. And the expression made something cold settle in my chest because I'd seen that smile before. It was the smile of someone who'd already won, who held all the meaningful cards, who knew that. Facts and evidence were irrelevant compared to the power to simply decide the outcome and enforce it. This isn't personal, Violet. It's business. He delivered the line with casual confidence, a phrase that absolved him of responsibility. How could firing someone based on fabricated performance issues be anything other than personal? But I saw the truth in his eyes, the calculation, the predetermined outcome. He slid an envelope across the table. My full name was typed on the front, Miss Violet Monroe. Not Violet Caldwell. The use of my maiden name felt intentional. A subtle assertion that I'd never truly belonged to their family. Your termination is effective immediately, Henry continued. Security will escort you to your desk. Your access credentials will be deactivated. Human resources will contact you. The lawyer made a careful note. Marcus still wouldn't meet my eyes. And I sat there, holding that envelope, understanding that this had never been about my performance. This was about power. And control. And Henry's need to eliminate anyone who threatened his narrative of singular genius. I'd become too competent. Too visible. Too successful in ways that reflected well on me rather than on him. My success was a threat. A quiet, steely resolve emerges. I stood slowly, picking up the termination letter with hands that somehow didn't shake. That would come later, the physical manifestation of shock and rage and betrayal. But in that moment, I was functioning on autopilot. I remember the way out, I said quietly, looking directly at Henry, holding eye contact until he was the one who looked away first. It's the same path I used when I built half the systems currently keeping this company operational. The systems that prevented those 3 breaches. The infrastructure that's generating the revenue that pays for this conference room, and your imported coffee, and whatever satisfaction you're getting from this moment. His expression flickered, just for a second. Something that might have been uncertainty. But it passed quickly, replaced by the smug satisfaction of a man who'd executed his plan perfectly. I collected my personal items under the watch of a security guard named Mitchell, who I'd personally trained on our access protocols 6 months earlier. He wouldn't look at me either, bearing witness to my humiliation with the uncomfortable posture of someone who knew this was wrong. I packed my chipped coffee mug. The framed photo of my mother from my college graduation. A small succulent plant. These objects that had made my workspace feel marginally personal were now evidence of my temporary status, easily packed into a cardboard box. My security badge felt heavier than it should have when I dropped it in the return tray. Angela, the receptionist, couldn't meet my eyes. Neither could the junior developers I'd mentored or Peterson from IT. They all knew what I knew. Poor results was corporate code for we're removing you before you become too powerful. A growing sense of dread, the foreshadowing of ultimate betrayal. The drive home felt surreal, disconnected, like watching footage of someone else's life. Traffic moved normally. People going about their routines, completely unaware that my professional identity had just been systematically dismantled. Why no? What had changed? The numbers were undeniable, the success documented. Unless that was precisely the problem. Maybe I'd become too successful. I thought about calling my mother, but I could already hear her voice saying the things she'd warned me about 3 years ago. I thought about calling Sarah, my best friend, but what would I even say? That I'd been fired for being too good at my job? It sounded insane. As I pulled into the parking garage, a new fear crystallized beneath the shock and anger. I would have to tell Jack. Would he defend me? Would he stand up for his wife against his father's decision? Or would he? The thought trailed off as I stepped into the elevator. But some part of me already knew the answer. Some part of me had known for months, had registered all the small signs and warnings I'd been deliberately ignoring. The elevator doors opened. I walked to our apartment door, keys in hand, dread settling in my stomach like a stone. I knew before I opened that door. Some instinct deeper than conscious thought had already read the situation and prepared me for what came next. I just hadn't imagined it would be quite this brutal. The moment of ultimate betrayal. Raw, visceral shock and anger. The key turned in the lock. I pushed open the door, expecting emptiness, silence, a few hours to process. Instead, I found Jack sitting at our kitchen island, like he'd been positioned there deliberately. The staging was obvious. His posture too casual, too prepared. A glass of scotch sat in front of him, barely past 10:30 in the morning. His laptop was open, angled just enough that I could see real estate listings on the screen. Not properties we might look at together for some future, but single-occupancy apartments and condos, filtered for one-bedroom spaces designed for a man living alone. He was dressed in the dark blue Henley shirt I'd bought him for his birthday. He looked utterly calm, while my world was still burning. "You're home early," he said, his tone carrying no surprise. No concern. Nothing that would suggest he didn't already know exactly what had happened. I set the cardboard box containing my office items on the counter between us. That pathetic small container representing 3 years of my professional life, reduced to a coffee mug, a photo frame, and a plant. The box made a hollow sound against the marble. "Your father fired me," I said, watching his face carefully for any sign of genuine reaction. Cited poor results. Funny thing about that, my results were actually the best in company history. 42% above target, 3 major breaches prevented, for millions saved. But apparently that doesn't meet expectations. Jack took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. And I watched something shift in his expression. Not guilt, which would have required him to feel he'd done something wrong. Not shock. Just a kind of resigned finality, the look of someone who'd been waiting for this specific conversation to arrive. He reached into a leather portfolio sitting beside his laptop, expensive leather, and slid a folded piece of paper across the marble toward me. This wasn't spontaneous. He'd prepared this. Rehearsed this exact moment. I picked up the paper and unfolded it, my hands starting to shake slightly. What I found inside made my breath catch in a way the firing itself hadn't managed. A printed list of women's shelters in the city. Each one highlighted in yellow marker. One circled in blue pen with a handwritten annotation in Jack's distinctive angular script, closest to the metro line. He'd taken the time to research transit access. He'd evaluated which shelter would be most convenient for a woman without a car, without resources. The cruelty of it was almost artful in its precision. Not just abandonment, but abandonment with a transit map. "Now that you're unemployed," Jack said, his voice carrying the same dispassionate, professional tone he used for conference calls. "This arrangement doesn't work for me anymore. I need someone who can contribute. Someone who's ascending, not falling." The words landed like individual physical blows. This man I'd shared a bed with, built what I'd believed was a life partnership with. He was talking about our marriage like it was a business partnership that had failed to generate expected returns. "You knew," I said. "It wasn't a question. Dad told me last week that he was planning to restructure your division," he admitted with a slight nod. "I figured we should both prepare for new chapters." It seemed like the practical thing to do. Restructure. The euphemism was almost beautiful in its cowardice. I looked down at the shelter list again, then around at the apartment we'd furnished together. The abstract paintings on the walls I'd chosen. The kitchen where we'd hosted dinner parties and cooked meals and pretended we were building something real and lasting. "You think I need this list?" I asked quietly, holding up the paper. He shrugged. "I'm just being practical. You don't have family money to fall back on. You'll need resources." I thought it would be helpful to have options researched ahead of time. The assumption underlying his words was staggering. That I was helpless without him and his family's resources. That I had nothing of my own. That firing me and discarding me would leave me desperate and broken. He'd actually convinced himself that providing this list was a kindness. Cold fury, Strategic thinking kicks in. I stood there holding that shelter list, and suddenly the full architecture of their betrayal assembled itself in my mind with devastating clarity. This wasn't impulse or sudden decision. This was coordination, careful planning, a strategy executed between father and son with the same precision they'd applied to any business deal. Henry had told Jack a week ago. 7 full days. Jack had spent an entire week knowing that his father intended to fire me, knowing that he himself intended to end our marriage. And he'd said nothing. He'd continued the performance of normal life, sitting across from me at breakfast, kissing me goodbye, all while holding this secret like ammunition. How many nights had he lain next to me planning this exit? How many conversations had father and son had about the problem of Violet, the wife who'd become inconvenient, the employee who'd become too competent? I'd blamed myself for his distance. I'd internalized it as my own failure. I'd auditioned desperately for a role that had already been recast, performing for judges who'd already rendered their verdict. The shame of that realization burned hotter than the anger. I'd been so carefully managed, so thoroughly manipulated. "I'll be gone by morning," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt, pulled from some reserve of dignity I hadn't known I still possessed. Jack actually looked relieved, his shoulders dropping. He'd probably anticipated arguments, tears, desperate negotiations. My calm acceptance clearly registered as the best possible outcome. A clean break. No drama. No messy emotional scenes. He didn't see what was happening inside me in that moment. Not rage, though that would come later. Not grief, though that was there, too. What crystallized in my chest was something colder and more precise than either of those emotions. It was clarity, sharp-edged and absolute. The transformation begins. From victim to architect of her own destiny, I packed methodically that evening while Jack stayed in the living room, probably scrolling through those real estate listings. I didn't take everything. I took only what mattered, what was actually mine. My laptop, which contained 3 years of work and documentation. My backup drives labeled innocuously as personal photos. The external hard drive I'd kept hidden in the back of my closet, which contained every patent filing, every line of proprietary code, every piece of documentation related to Monroe Security Solutions. I left behind the jewelry Jack had given me, the designer clothes his mother had encouraged me to buy. All the trappings of the life I'd been auditioning for. What Jack didn't know, what Henry didn't know, was that I wasn't Violet Monroe, struggling, unemployed tech worker facing homelessness. I was Violet Monroe, founder and primary patent holder of the security architecture that powered every significant system at Caldwell Technologies. They thought they'd fired an employee, discarded an inconvenient wife, eliminated a problem. What they'd actually done was terminate their license agreement with the architect who'd built the foundation their entire company stood on. And that license, with its carefully constructed renewal clauses and good faith provisions, was about to expire. I left the apartment before dawn, carrying 2 suitcases and the cardboard box from my office, leaving behind a marriage and a life that had never truly belonged to me. The city was still dark. I drove downtown to the Riverside Hotel, a mid-range establishment where the front desk staff asked no questions when I paid cash. Room 847 became my operations center. The space was generic, but I spread my laptop and backup drives across the desk, positioning everything with the methodical precision of someone preparing for surgery. The meticulous plan unfolds, a quiet, chilling satisfaction. I pulled up the licensing agreement I drafted 2 years earlier when Caldwell Technologies had first acquired what they believed was my security framework. I began reviewing every clause with the focused intensity of someone whose entire future depended on the accuracy of legal language written in a very different emotional state. The Sentinel Protocol, the heart of Caldwell's security, wasn't theirs. It had never been theirs. They'd licensed it from Monroe Security Solutions, the shell company I'd registered in Delaware specifically to protect my intellectual property. The license agreement was 37 pages of dense technical and legal language that Henry and his lawyers had apparently skimmed rather than studied, operating under the assumption that it was standard software licensing boilerplate. They'd been catastrophically wrong. Buried in Section 12, subsection D, was a clause I'd written with particular care. It gave me unilateral termination rights in the event of a material breach of good faith dealing with the intellectual property creator. Section 19 defined that creator explicitly and exclusively as any individual or entity holding primary patents on the licensed technology, which meant me. The license renewal date was 72 hours away. Without my explicit approval, their entire security infrastructure would begin experiencing cascading failures. I sat in that hotel room, reviewing documents until my eyes burned. Then I began drafting the formal notice that would trigger everything that came next. The trigger is pulled, a calm, deliberate act of retribution. At 2:15 a.m., unable to sleep despite exhaustion, I finalized the language. The notice was brief, professionally phrased, almost polite, pursuant to Section 12D of License Agreement MT 2847. Monroe Security Solutions hereby provides notice of material breach regarding treatment of intellectual property creator. Automatic license renewal is suspended pending contract renegotiation and resolution of outstanding grievances. This suspension becomes effective at 6 o'clock hours Eastern Standard Time, September 24th. I attached a PDF copy of the original licensing agreement, with the specific provisions highlighted in yellow marker, the same color Jack had used on the homeless shelters. The visual parallel felt appropriate. I scheduled the email to send automatically at 6 o'clock the following morning to Caldwell Technologies' legal department, copying Henry and Peterson from IT. Then I did something that would seem small, but carried enormous technical weight. I accessed the back-end administration panel of the Sentinel protocol using credentials Henry had never thought to revoke because he'd never understood they existed. With a series of keystrokes that took less than 30 seconds, I suspended the automatic license renewal. The systems wouldn't crash immediately. Instead, they would begin experiencing what would appear to be random authentication failures. Client access portals would lag. Internal communications would flag false threats. Security certificates would time out. It would feel like a building where the foundation was slowly crumbling, unnoticed at first, but becoming impossible to ignore. I closed my laptop, set an alarm, and tried to sleep. Exhaustion eventually won over anxiety. The chaos begins, a quiet, almost smug satisfaction. The first call came at 6:04 a.m., exactly 4 minutes after their systems would have started experiencing initial failures. Henry's office line, marked urgent. I watched it ring through to voicemail while sipping bitter, weak coffee from the in-room machine. 3 minutes later, another call. Then Jack's personal cell, which I'd already blocked. Henry's personal cell. Peterson from IT. Someone from their legal department. By noon, my phone displayed 78 missed calls and a cascading flood of text messages that grew increasingly desperate. The messages told their own story of mounting panic. Early ones were professional. Violet, we need to discuss some technical issues. Please call. Then the facade cracked. This is urgent. Please respond immediately. Then the pretense of professional courtesy disappeared entirely. Whatever this is about, we can work it out. Just call me back. And finally, from Henry himself, just after 11:30, name your price. Name my price, as if this were simply a negotiation about money. The assumptions embedded in those 3 words told me everything I needed to know about how fundamentally Henry had misunderstood what was happening. I let them sweat for 3 days. Not out of cruelty, though I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in knowing they were panicking while I sat calmly drinking bad coffee. The silence was strategic. I needed them to fully understand the extent of their dependency. I needed them to bring in outside consultants who would scratch their heads at code that was simultaneously brilliant and completely impenetrable without my documentation. I needed Henry to sit in emergency board meetings trying to explain why the company's competitive advantage was evaporating. And I needed time to field the other calls that were starting to come in, the good ones, from companies who'd heard through industry back channels that the architect behind Caldwell's systems might suddenly be available. An emotional anchor, a moment of profound love and support on the second night. Sitting in that hotel room with takeout food going cold, I finally called my mother. She answered on the first ring. Violet, baby, where are you? Jack's been calling me, saying you left, that he's worried. I need you to listen, Mom, I interrupted, my voice steadier than I felt. Something in my tone made her go immediately quiet. I told her everything. The firing, the shelter list, the coordinated betrayal, the license agreement they'd never properly read, the systems that were currently failing in ways they couldn't fix without me. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she said something I hadn't expected, something that broke through the careful control I'd been maintaining. I have $48,000 in savings. It's yours if you need it. My mother, who'd raised me alone after my father died in a construction accident, who'd worked double shifts as a nurse for 15 years to keep us housed and fed and put me through college without debt, who'd never had extra money for vacations or luxuries. She was offering me her entire financial security. Mom, I don't need. I started, but she interrupted with the firmness that had gotten us both through the hardest years of my childhood. I know you don't need it. You never did. But I need you to know you have it. You're not alone, baby. You never were. I broke then. Not from sadness, but from something fiercer and more complicated. Gratitude and rage and determination. Tears came that I hadn't allowed myself since Jack had slid that shelter list across the counter. I'm going to make them understand what they did, I told her, my voice thick. I know you are, she said with absolute certainty. And I'll be here when you do. That conversation changed something fundamental in how I understood what I was doing. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was for my mother, for every woman who'd been told she was nothing without the man who married her. For everyone who'd ever been discarded like a quarterly report. The final strike, a surgical, calculated blow. The calls from Caldwell Technologies continued. By the end of day 3, the count had exceeded 100. I was done responding to their schedule. On the 4th morning, I woke at 5:30 without an alarm. The anxiety and second-guessing had crystallized overnight into absolute clarity. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and began drafting the email that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic. It needed to be perfect, not emotional, not accusatory, just factual. I addressed it to Henry's private email address. No greeting, no preamble. Just a single sentence. Please find attached documentation regarding the ownership and licensing structure of the security systems currently powering Caldwell Technologies operations. The first attachment was the complete licensing agreement for the Sentinel protocol, all 37 pages, with specific provisions highlighted in yellow. Section 12D, outlining material breach conditions. Section 19, explicitly defining the intellectual property creator as the primary patent holder. Section 23, detailing my unilateral authority to terminate or suspend the license under specified circumstances, including, and I'd been very careful about this language, treatment of the creator that could reasonably be interpreted as acting in bad faith or failing to acknowledge their contributions appropriately. The second attachment contained every patent filing I'd submitted for components of the Sentinel protocol, each one registered to Monroe Security Solutions, months before Caldwell Technologies had supposedly acquired the system. Each filing listed me as the sole inventor, my maiden name appearing on every official document. Henry had apparently never investigated any of this. Why would he? I was just his son's wife, hired as a diversity checkbox. The arrogance embedded in that assumption was almost impressive. At the bottom of the email, below the 2 attachments, I added a single line that felt appropriate. You fired the architect. The building is noticing. I hit send at exactly 6 a.m., the same time their systems had begun experiencing cascading failures 4 days earlier. The aftermath, a powerful reversal of roles. My phone rang at 7:14. Henry's private cell number. I let it ring 4 times before answering. A small, petty gesture, but it satisfied something in me. Violet. His voice carried none of the smooth authority I'd heard 4 days ago. He sounded diminished. We need to meet face to face. No, I said, keeping my voice calm and level. You need to listen. 3 years ago, you hired me as what you clearly viewed as a favor to your son. You treated me like a diversity checkbox, someone who should be grateful for the opportunity to exist in your orbit. You assigned me maintenance work that was beneath my capabilities, and you never bothered to learn what I was actually building. When you needed to upgrade your security systems 2 years ago, I provided the solution through a licensing agreement that your lawyers apparently didn't read with appropriate care. You thought you were acquiring technology outright. You were renting it from me. That's not, Henry started. I cut him off. The license renewal came due 3 days ago. I declined to approve it. Every system currently keeping your company operational is now running on borrowed time. Your client portals are experiencing authentication failures. Your internal communications are flagging false security threats. Your competitive advantage is evaporating in real time. And all of it traces directly back to the woman you fired for supposedly poor results that were actually the best performance metrics in company history. Another silence. Longer, this time, heavy with the sound of a man processing information that was rewriting his understanding of his own situation. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Smaller. Uncertain. What do you want, Violet? The question revealed how completely he'd misunderstood. He still thought this was a negotiation. Justice, I said. But I'll settle for watching you explain to your board of directors why your company's entire infrastructure is held together with licensing agreements controlled by the woman you just fired for fabricated performance issues. Henry tried to recover his footing. We can offer you reinstatement immediately. Better title. Vice President level. Equity stake. Whatever it takes to make this right. I don't want to work for you, Henry, I said, and I meant it with a clarity that surprised me. I want you to understand what you destroyed wasn't just a job. It was a partnership you never deserved and never appreciated until it was too late. You're trying to destroy the company, he said, anger creeping back into his voice. No, I corrected firmly. I'm teaching you the cost of underestimation. The company can survive this. The real question is whether you can survive it. I ended the call. The industry had moved faster than I'd anticipated. My inbox had begun filling with messages from people who wanted to know more. Sarah called that afternoon. You're a legend in tech circles right now, she said. People are calling it the quietest power move of the decade. Caldwell's stock was tanking. A surprisingly gentle moment of closure and a powerful lesson on the second night. Sitting in that hotel room, I finally called my mother. She listened intently as I recounted the tale, and when I finished, she simply said, I have $48,000 in savings. It's yours if you need it. My mother, who had sacrificed so much for me, was offering her entire life savings. I told her I didn't need it. I know you don't, baby, she said with a fierce love, but I need you to know you have it. You're not alone. You never were. I broke then, not from sadness, but from a profound gratitude and a steely determination. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was for her and for every woman who had been underestimated. 2 weeks later, Jack tried his own approach. He showed up at my new office building downtown. I pulled up the security camera feed on my phone and watched him standing there, holding expensive roses. He looked smaller than I remembered. Ms. Monroe, the guard called up, there's a Jack Caldwell here to see you. Says he's your husband. I looked at the monitor. And I felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, not even satisfaction. Just a kind of neutral observation. No, I said. Tell him I'm in a meeting that's running long. He should try calling. I watched him leave the flowers and walk out, shoulders hunched. My new position at Titanium Solutions provided exactly what Caldwell Technologies had denied: autonomy, resources, recognition. We launched Sentinel Protocol 2 months after my termination from Caldwell. The audience included several companies I recognized as Caldwell clients. Within 3 weeks, major clients had formally requested proposals for switching their security infrastructure. The market was voting with contracts. Late one evening, working alongside Clara, my new engineering partner, she asked me, "Do you feel satisfied?" Watching Caldwell Technologies implode, Henry under investigation, Jack showing up with desperate flowers. Is it what you thought it would be? I opened my mouth to say yes, but the words caught in my throat. The truth was more complicated. I felt vindicated, validated. But satisfied? There was a hollowness. What I'd actually wanted wasn't revenge. I'd wanted recognition, acknowledgement that my contributions had value. I'd wanted Henry to see me as genuinely talented. I'd wanted Jack to love me for who I actually was. But I would never receive that from them. They lacked the humility for real change. It's not about satisfaction, I finally told Clara. It's about building something they can't take away. Something that exists independently of whether they acknowledge it or not. She nodded slowly, like she understood. The revenge that matters isn't destruction, but creation. Not tearing down what hurt you, but building something new that can't be touched by the same hands that once discarded you. We created the Monroe Fellowship Program, providing opportunities for women who'd left toxic workplaces, who'd been told they were too much for corporate environments that preferred compliance over competence. My mother flew in for the opening of our expanded office. "Your father would have been so proud of you," she said, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't do this alone, Mom," I told her. "You taught me everything that made this possible." She shook her head. "No, baby. I taught you how to survive. You taught yourself how to build, how to create rather than just endure. That's different, and it's all you." One October, a young engineer named Maya joined Monroe Security Solutions. She was 26, brilliant, and recently laid off from a company that told her she wasn't a cultural fit. I took her to lunch on her first day. "How did you actually do it?" she asked. "Go from being fired to building this company? Everyone talks about resilience, but what did that actually look like for you?" "I stopped waiting for permission to be valuable," I told her. "I stopped believing that my worth was determined by whether other people recognized it. And I stopped building things for people who treated my contributions like favors they were granting me, rather than essential work that deserved appropriate compensation and respect." She nodded. "I'm really angry," she admitted. "At the people who discarded me. At the systems that allowed it. At myself for not seeing the warning signs." "Good," I said. "Anger is useful fuel when it's directed appropriately. Just don't let it become your permanent destination. Use it to build something better. Then let it go when you don't need it anymore." Concluding thought, full circle, triumphant, and free, driving home through the city, I passed the Caldwell Technologies building. I felt nothing but mild curiosity. Henry had officially retired. Jack had relocated to the West Coast for a fresh start. The empire they'd attempted to build through control had contracted. I didn't feel triumphant observing this. I just felt free, finally unburdened by the need for their acknowledgement or their downfall. I'd learned something essential. The most effective response to being erased isn't destruction of those who wronged you. It's building something so undeniably your own that they become irrelevant footnotes in a story they never understood they were losing the right to narrate. I drove home to my apartment, modest but genuinely mine, filled with furniture I'd chosen, books I actually read, and art that meant something personal. My phone showed a text from my mother, "Proud of you every single day." I sat in my car for a moment, engine off, city lights creating patterns through the windshield. And I let myself feel the full weight and lightness of what I'd built from the ashes of betrayal. Then I went inside and opened my laptop to review proposals for the next phase of company expansion. Because that's what architects do. We build. Call to action. Direct, personal, engaging. If this story of strategic justice and quiet triumph had you captivated from that first boardroom betrayal to Violet's ultimate success, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when she suspended the license renewal and watched those 78 desperate calls pile up while she calmly drank her coffee. What about you? Tell me, what would you have done if you walked into that kitchen and saw that list? Have you ever had to build your own escape route from a situation that felt impossible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching. Take care. Good luck.